Hello, and welcome to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I am your host, Shannon Vasconcelos, and this is my first hosting duty of 2024. So happy New Year to everyone out there. It's not such a happy New Year in my house. I've got a sick kid home from school today, but we did get the positive strep test this morning. So that is my favorite. I love a good strep throat because you can get the antibiotics and they start feeling better almost right away. So I hope all the parents out there can sympathize with me. That strep throat is the best. We're all big fans of the strep throat over here, comparatively.
Just that little bit. Strep throat is the best, and remove
It
all the
is.
context.
Exactly. Forget the rest of it. You can fix it pretty quickly. And I guess the other big thing in my life for the past couple of weeks now has been the FAFSA rollout, the brand new and maybe improved FAFSA. We'll find out in our third segment. We're going to be talking all about that rollout. In our second segment, we are going to be talking about college visits. And in our first segment, I am joined by my colleague and former admissions officer, I think all over the place, Lewis and Clark, Middlebury, Colorado, Nial Rele. Welcome, Nial.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you are so welcome. I'm so glad to have you, and I'm glad you are equally a fan of strep throat.
Indeed.
So, Nial, you and I are going to be talking about how to build a college list. And I sometimes wonder when I say the term college list, do people understand exactly what that means? The list of colleges you are going to apply to eventually is what we're talking about. And I think there's something like 4,000 colleges in the US. So, how are we getting from that number down to a manageable list? How can we decide of those 4,000 colleges, which ones are we going to apply to? That's sort of the general point of our conversation today. So to start, what is the best time to start thinking about building that college list? I think we have students and parents across the spectrum of ages. When is actually the right time to start thinking about that list?
Great question. And I'd say that researching colleges itself, right, can and should be a process. And it shouldn't be rushed. Certainly building a college list shouldn't feel rushed. So particularly when you kick off junior year, if you are able to do so with a mind to really intentional and in-depth college research, that is a fantastic way to go. If you happen to have started earlier, that's fine too. But certainly as you're kicking into junior year, and perhaps some folks that are listening in right now have juniors and they're sort of halfway through their year already, in which case now is an excellent time to get serious about that research, about really identifying options that might be a good fit for your students. And now's the time. And then in terms of having a list, setting a goal for sort of when that should be largely wrapped up, it our recommendation tends to be, as you're ending your junior year at school, summer hasn't kicked off yet. If you're able to line it up in a way that you have your list at the end of your school year, you are putting yourself in a really great position to make the most of your summer, switching gears, starting to actually work on your applications themselves, right? You can give yourself the biggest gift you possibly can by doing a lot of your writing for your college applications over the summer. So that's part of why we sort of think along those lines with the timeline.
That makes a lot of sense, though. I think it's probably a hard sell to get students to start writing instead of going to the beach over the summer.
It is, but as fall semester starts as a senior, and you are put in 100 different directions. And
Yes.
on top of everything else, you have your college essays and your applications to think about. And we've worked with so many students that have been able to really be so much more intentional about having several drafts of their main college essays, so on and so forth, and feel really good about how they're positioning themselves in their applications by giving them the time that they already do have. And in the summer, of course, you land up having a little bit more flexibility.
Yeah. And you certainly, I think senior year can be stressful enough. You don't want to go into senior year still trying to figure out where you're applying. If you can nail that list down beforehand, I think that you'll be happier in the end. You'll thank yourself. Your future self will thank you.
Exactly.
Right. So how do you actually get started on that reason? What is the first step in building that college list?
Yeah, and the first thing I would do, I wouldn't even start by thinking about individual colleges. I would think about yourself, right? I would sit down, find a notebook open an Excel page and list out every factor that you can think of that you might feel is even remotely important for you
Mhm.
to have in the college environment. And try to be as inclusive and long form as possible as you list these out, right? It could be availability of certain majors, of geography and setting. It could be the size of the campus, the size of the classroom setting, the culture, diversity on campus, dining options, whatever it is, right? Let's say have a goal of having 30 things on that list, right?
Mhm.
And once you're done listing those out, really reflect on them and try to order them in order of priority for yourself, right? So this is a chance for you to go through an exercise that can be really clarifying for yourself as to what's important without thinking through the lens of individual colleges
Yeah.
just yet, even at that point. So that might be a really great starting point. And that's when you sort of can then launch into the exploration of colleges. And Serena is going to talk about a little bit of it when in terms of sort of how to make the most of a visit to a campus. But you might also be able to do a ton of research online. There's incredible tools available to you to do research online, college websites. Colleges also have a lot of online engagement opportunities nowadays, particularly post the pandemic. You can register for things that happen online. So that's a sort of next step is to begin that research process. And perhaps one thing that you can do, right, is consider in your area, in your immediate vicinity as well, what are the colleges that surround me, and how do I begin to expose myself to the variety of what's out there?
Right.
So, for instance, let's say that you live in Boston, right? And it's not necessarily about I'm going to visit Wellesley or learn about Wellesley so that I can decide whether to apply to Wellesley or not. But instead, it can then be what is it like to be at a small liberal arts college that happens to be pretty close to a big city and has a sort of a campus and has a sort of a classroom environment. So you're sort of testing out your hypotheses in a sense. And to
Yes.
the contrary, you could be at BU and see something totally different. You could be at UMass Amherst and see something totally different. You don't have to drive very far to be able to do all of
Yeah.
that and get that experience. And I'm sure Serena will sort of dig into that in a little bit more detail. But that's a great way to kick things off, thinking
I love
about
that.
that exercise and then exploration just in your area as well.
That's wonderful. And I think you mentioned the websites of the colleges themselves can be a good resource. Are there any other good sort of online resources that you can tap into to help figure this out?
Totally. There's a great website. It's called Big Future and it's hosted by College Board. It has really great filtering functionality, right? So if you want to say, okay, I really want to look at colleges in this area of this size that offer this certain major, you can sort of tool it in a way it's producing for you colleges that match a lot of those criteria. College Navigator is another such website that kind of puts things in a map, right? And
Right.
makes it accessible in a little bit of a different way. Um, the FISC Guide to Colleges might not be the best place to start, but
Mhm.
they do tend to. It's a book, and it goes through sort of in a narrative format, um, a summary of what a college is all about in a couple of
Mhm.
pages, and so that's another great resource that comes to mind. As you mentioned, the college websites are fantastic.
Yeah.
You learn a lot about the values of an institution by seeing what they are putting up front and center as well on their websites. And in addition to that, you can even go to YouTube, right, and say a day in the life of a student at X college, and you'll be surprised. There's a
Ah,
really nice way to sort of get an insight into life of a student on campus in a little bit of an unfiltered way by doing that sort of exploration as well. But there might also be other resources available to you through your school.
mm,
So it's possible, for instance, that your school has access to something called Navion, so something called
mhm.
SCORE, these platforms that help college counseling offices sort of stay organized with their
Yeah.
students. So take a look and see if that exists because there's a ton of inbuilt resource around college exploration and research through those platforms as well.
That's fantastic. And as you're doing this research, what exactly should you be looking at? What should you be looking for? What do you think are the factors that you should be considering as you're building your list?
As you're building your list, you want to sort of go back to again your starting point, which was yourself, right? And how you've seen these factors that are important to you show up in the different places that you're researching. But now that you're getting down to sort of the brass tacks of building the list itself, you want to get a sense of what are the bounds of this, right? So what is a good total number of colleges to apply to? We recommend aiming for between 7 and 10, right? We in fact did some research internally a few years ago, and we found that for students that apply to more than 12 universities, that for every additional university that they apply to, their overall chances of admission to the colleges that they were applying to started to table out or drop. And our hypothesis there is that they were spreading themselves a little bit too thin, because while some applications can be quite similar, it does take effort and attention for pretty much every single application to ensure that you're putting your best foot forward. And that's part of the reason why we really want to limit that number. As probability works, it's not really a game of I add another college in and therefore I'm going to improve my chances of getting in. Yeah, quite the contrary, in fact, right? So that number, of course, and then balance on the list, particularly in terms of selectivity relative to your academic profile as a student. And it might also be that the major that you select might influence that sense of selectivity too, right? There's some majors at some colleges, computer science and engineering are great examples that there might be a lot of pressure on that major, and as a result, it might be a lot more selective than the sort of overall selectivity of that place. So some factors to keep in mind as well. And when we think about selectivity, we often think about, folks might be familiar with the term sort of reach college, target college, safety college.
Yep.
We use similar language at College Coach, but we don't think anything is safe necessarily in college admissions, right? So you might hear us talk about reach colleges where a student's academic profile might not be as strong as a typical admitted student for that school. And we recommend that you apply to a couple of reach schools because you should push yourself in terms of selectivity as you go through this process. But the bulk of your list, 3 to 5 colleges, should come from what we call the possible range, which is where your academic profile tends to match that of a typical admitted student, right? So that's the bulk of your list, but that was sort of the target range in other terms. And then another couple of colleges that are probable options where your likelihood of admission is pretty good, but not certain, but your academic profile is stronger than that of a typical admitted student. So that part of the equation as well as you're thinking. And then I'll say that there's other factors. You want to be super strategic about this as well. And for instance, college finance, the cost and availability of scholarship, availability of aid should be a factor. And Shannon, I'll perhaps pass it to you to sort of delve into that. How do you bring that into the process of building a list?
Yeah, and it is tricky, but I would actually start by taking a step back and saying, before you even think about the list, and again, as you mentioned, starting off with thinking about yourself and what's important to you, apply that same sort of thinking to the cost of college. And I would first take a look at what you're willing to pay more or pay less for, and what resources you have available. Thinking about, you've got savings, hopefully. What can you devote out of your cash flow on a monthly basis to college payments? Are you willing to borrow? And if so, how much? And kind of do that analysis first to get at your bottom line. And then look for colleges that meet your bottom line. And that could be in terms of their sticker price, that you can simply afford the sticker price of the college. But most people don't pay full sticker price. You may qualify for need-based financial aid or merit scholarships. So those need to enter the equation. I'll tell you, on college websites, they have a great tool called the net price calculator that can help with calculating need-based aid eligibility. You can look at an admitted student profile to see if academically you're above or below average, to help figure out if merit scholarships are a possibility. But sort of in general, I think if you have that nice balanced list that you talked about in terms of probable, possible, and reach schools, if you have that kind of balance as well as a financial balance, maybe some private schools mixed in with some public schools, you tend to have your bases covered, I think, in terms of the finances, and we'll end up with some good options at the end.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and that in a nutshell is the process of building a list, right? And a couple of
Yeah.
things that I would certainly recommend to keep in mind as you navigate this process.
Yeah.
One is there's a bunch of people here that have your back, right? Your
Yeah.
friends, your family, and bring them into this process
Yes.
because it should be a fun process, particularly the process of researching colleges, of building your list. In some senses, you're shopping around for where you're going to spend the next 4 years of your
Yeah.
life, right? And also, of course, your counseling team at your high school.
Yeah.
If your company happens to be a college coach company, Bright Horizons College Coach Company,
Yep.
we certainly spend a lot of time supporting students with building customized college lists. So take a look into that, right? If that's part of what's accessible to you. And again, going back to that critical point about trying to identify fit, right? And
Yeah.
starting with yourself. And once you are narrowing down your list, going back to that list that you might have created months prior of those things that were important to you, now that you have some colleges in mind, rate them on a scale of 1 to 5 across all these things all these criteria that you set for yourself, right? And do a gut
Yeah.
check in terms of, does this college show up on my list just because of its ranking, or is it show up because it really truly is an excellent fit for what I want in an experience?
Right. Does it match your personal rankings of what's important to you as opposed to US News Report or some other source that is not you and may not be the best place to start?
Exactly right. And so that's the process again in a nutshell. And hopefully you've picked up some good pointers about how to go about building a college list.
Definitely. And we're just about out of time. Before we go, is there a next step you can point folks to once you've built that list? What's the next step?
Get organized, right? Get a sense of the deadlines, get a sense of the expectations to complete those applications and start to map that out. We talked about trying to make the use of your summer as best as possible.
Yeah.
Perhaps now that would also be the time, if it lines up towards the end of your junior year, to ensure that you have recommendation letter requests out to the teachers that do that too, right? So some of those other pieces, you're switching modes now, right? You've figured out where you want to apply, and now the rubber hits the road. You're starting to think about how do I make the most of the time that I have to put my best foot forward.
That's perfect. That's great. I hope that's enough to get folks started. Thank you so much, Nial, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. And listeners, stick around. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, our colleague Serena will be here to help us with how to approach college visits. So stay tuned.